Once you have your subtractive synth in its initialized state, the next place I often go is to the voicing tab, and I want to figure out a few things about the instrument that I have for the sake of comparison. First question I almost always ask is this instrument capable of playing chords? And so if I play a C major 7th, let's go up an octave, I can hear that harmony there. If I just play my C major triad, my C minor, or something else, I can clearly hear that this instrument is polyphonic, meaning that multiple notes can be played at the same time, and we actually are hearing that key tracking as such. So when we play a C major chord, we hear a C major chord. Now, that may not always be true depending on limitations to voices, something that we saw towards the end of that video with diversion. But if I go in here and I turn on this mono button, and then I try to play chords, it's not happening. So I've been limited now to just one note being allowed to trigger at any given time. And don't get monophonic and polyphonic confused with like voicing, so to speak, or I should say don't believe that because your instrument has been put into monophonic mode, that's not still capable of like stacking voices. And that's definitely true in this instrument, because where our voices actually lie is within the oscillators. So we'll look at a few examples and show you kind of where to navigate. But we can see here I have one voice, and I'm putting the unison spread all the way down to 0 here. We have just one sawtooth. What if I want two sawtooths? 3, 4, 5, up to 10. We can go all the way to 16. We can even go down to oscillator 2 and put that up to 16, which would then mean 32 simultaneous voices being played. If we were to hit 2 notes with monophonic turned off, that would be 64 voices being played and triggered all at one time. All right, and now this doesn't really do anything special. It actually sounds better with just one voice until we start to use this Unison Detune and spread feature, which is going to slightly detune the instruments and also, I believe, start to put them into different places in the stereo field. So if I go to my Unison, start to spread these out, we can go really crazy with it. Just sounds like an out of tune instrument. We can bring it back. This instrument, the sweet spot's about 18. So if we start to bring in a balance here with oscillator 2, are we really adding in another voice? Technically we are with how this instrument is set up, but I don't like this isn't always true, where like a balance of oscillators is necessarily going to mean like 2 voices. So you have 3 oscillators, they're all playing sound. Does that mean that you're using up 3 voices? Typically not. Typically it's just one voice and it's a blend. But with this instrument, it's determined a little bit differently. So in my opinion, when I bring in the second oscillator here, I would call this 11 voices now. Let's bring this down to more of a sub range. So let's even bring up more voices. And so if I was to go down an octave or something, this would work as a great starting point for like a bass sound. And if I was to be making a bass sound, I'd probably want that to be monophonic. I'm not going to be hitting more than one note at a time. It's going to be way too messy if I was. Now, along with voicing, you oftentimes find your glide. So this is a pitch glide setting. And here, if I bring this way up, when I go from one note to the next, we're hearing that glide occur each and every time. Often you'll find that you have a legato switch, or in this case it's called legato glide. So only glide will occur when played legato. Legato just means you're playing one note over another. So now if I'm playing and you hear a pause between the 2 notes, we're not hearing any sort of glide. But if I hit one note And now I trigger another one while I'm still pressing the key. You hear that that's when glide occurs. So that's a very common configuration for like a bass or something like that. All right, so that is voicing inside of the polysynth. So we can see, and what I'm really trying to stress and drive home to you is that you can be in mono mode and oftentimes still stack voices on top of one another. If we go out of mono mode here, in this case, I'd probably go back all the way to oscillator 1, go up an octave. If we're playing 2 notes with 12 voices, what we're really doing is triggering 24 voices. I bring in a third note, 36 voices, 48. And this is the basis for a lot of like, I don't know, like the trance music back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s was just stacking as many voices as possible with sawtooth waves, creating that epic super saw, and then using it to play chords. And so you clearly did hear a lot of these sort of sounds being played time and time again. All right, that's one example. We'll look at a few more instruments to drive this point home. With the polysynth, we really didn't see a voice limit, but here with Synth 1, we have a great example, a visual example of the number of voices we have access to and what happens when we kind of overshoot that. So right now, we can see if I hit a note, let's turn this down quite a bit. We're just going through. All right, just one voice being triggered at a time. If I wanted to play chords, you could see 3 voices being taken up or 4 voices being taken up. Now, one thing I should have mentioned with the polysynth is that if you have a very long release, you see how those voices are still hanging on? You see that they're grayed out there? If I have a long release, it's possible that some of those voices are having to be cut off in order for the other ones to make room. Now, it's not making a big deal here because the sound is so thick and the release is so long that by the time I'm hitting other notes, the ones that are being cut off are virtually at silence anyway. But that is something to be aware of, and a reason why when you have a really thick sound, a lot of times the release is basically at 0 and you have some kind of very short delay that's making the sound linger. That's something you'll notice a lot with presets. I guess actually more so in the past. Nowadays, the voice limits are like 256. So unless, you're worried about CPU or something like that, you really can get away with actually leaving a little bit of a release tail on there. But I also want to show you that with this instrument, each oscillator, if I bring in oscillator 2 and I bring in my sub-oscillator, is not constituting an additional voice. So if I go and we have a sawtooth and we have a square here, we'll hear still just constituting one voice down here in our little voicing display. If I bring the sub in, same deal. Detune it a little bit. So can we stack voices? Can we make a duplicate of this? We absolutely can. We go to our Unison Detune, we flip that on, and now we can actually go from 1, or actually 2 by default, obviously. It needs to create at least 1 copy, so this would be 1 copy at 2, all the way up to 8 copies. And in this case, it's a copying of these 3 oscillators all together. So I just want to make sure we can hear this. And these are more or less just randomization controls for each of the stacks that's being created. You can go up to 8, or you can stay all the way down at 2. So what's interesting is that if we just leave our limit at 16 here, we're only going to be able to hit 2 notes at the same time. After that, things start getting cut off. And in this case too, even if I'm still holding down notes, it literally cuts them off. So you'll see that, hopefully you can see that there's a little icon that lights up when I do put a MIDI input in here. I'm still holding down notes, but they're just getting cut off. Luckily, I can take this and I can go all the way up to 32, which would then give me the ability to hit, 4 notes. And actually, this just sounds really annoying because of that sub being brought in. Let's bring that down. So here's where you could get into a little bit of trouble with the release. It's got to still even be longer than that. So you can hear that cutoff occurring. So when we're playing the instrument like this, we're really using up all those voices like almost constantly. All right, you're seeing how long it's taking for them to come back away. And this is why you might use something like a delay and even like a chorus to push this out even further so we could take this release down. Let's go bring it down to like a 16th note. Bring the feedback up. Okay, here we go. This is what I was looking for. Come on. Just trying to find the sweet spots here. So you can hear that we can still get a really, really thick sound out of this thing, even when we are limited. And nowadays, they could really even probably bump this up to be a much greater number if they really needed to. Probably it's unnecessary because of how thick we're getting, but we're not even really touching the CPU at all here. And that's oftentimes in the past, that was the big concern. So just wanted to show you that, and we'll look at a couple more instruments and make further comparisons. Where voicing gets a lot more interesting and where you usually have to be much more vigilant is when you go with the analog modeled instruments, because voice stacking is something that in the computer and with software, very simple to achieve, but with hardware, much, much more difficult and also, pretty expensive. So if we're here with the Mini Moog and we're on the initialized patch that I've created, we can hear that if I try to play chords, it's impossible, and there's no feature in here, even if I go to the B panel, that's going to make that possible for me to do. This is a monophonic instrument, and so it's really designed and used for leads and for basses. That's what it's well known for. That's what it does. But just because we're limited to working in monophonic doesn't mean that we still can't get a really thick sound out of this, and that's why we have our multiple oscillators here. So I can bring in oscillator 2, bring that down an octave. I could bring in oscillator 3, bring that up an octave. And we now have a very thick starting point. And you can also still see that we have various glide options here. We even have 2 different algorithms, the Mini Moog version and then something they call Silver. I don't know the history of that, but I do know they sound different, and you can kind of experiment there. So just because an instrument may be analog modeled doesn't mean it's a bad thing, right? You just have to use what the instrument gives you. And in the case of this instrument, monophonic, impossible to play chords, but for basses and for leads, certainly still very useful. One other great example is the OBXD, and this one is very specific to voices, and you can see that we even have two full little modules here dedicated to voice variation and voice panning, as well as a variety of legato options for what happens when voices do run out. So if we try to play chords with this instrument, it's absolutely possible to do that. And what's so interesting here is that when we go to the spread control and we start to turn this up, what this gives us the ability to do is now to spread these voices out independently. So if I start going, we'll just go from like left to right and start to bring this back, and you're going to hear what happens. It's very interesting. As I go through and start to play each of these voices, if we're just going one at a time, think back to what we saw with the synth 1, right? So then this gets really interesting if we start to actually do something with the variation here, make each of these kind of react a little bit differently. It's very subtle, but it's useful. But now if I'm playing chords, it almost feels like something random is going on. We also have a unison option if we want to take this instrument and compress it down, make it monophonic, but then still have the 8-voice stack. We can do that as well. There it is. I was trying to find the spot there with the tuning. So now, as we spread those voices out, we get this really thick monophonic sound. So it's just interesting how you can kind of mess around with that and see how with every instrument, especially with the analog modeled ones, see how they handle the voicing and see what you can do stacking wise, or in this case, spreading wise, panning wise. Definitely one of the more fun parameters to mess with. All right, we're going to close out this discussion on voicing with a few modern instruments, beginning here with Massive. We can see we have a voices count up here. When we hit a few notes, by default, this instrument is in a polyphonic mode. Let me just go in here and quickly set up more of a gate message. All right, good. That's kind of where I want to be. And you'll notice that when I bring in my other oscillators here, if I bring in oscillator 2 and oscillator 3, that is not accounting for additional voices. It's still going to show us one voice. And we'll bring this one up to 24. Bring that down a little bit. All right, so this is a pretty thick sound on its own, and we could make this stereo by going in and using some of these effects, like the chorus, for example. We could really widen that sound out, and for the longest time, and this was many moons ago, I thought that was kind of the only way to get that really wide, huge sound that I knew was capable in Massive from flicking through a lot of the presets. But when I discovered the voicing tab, that really kind of changed things for me. So you can see we're in polyphonic mode. We could also go into monophonic mode here, and then we could adjust the number of max voicings available to us. So we can take this all the way up to 64. But really, when we start to go into the unisono, what we're doing is we're duplicating this whole sort of collection of oscillators, these 3 oscillators. So adding in an additional voice is really like going from 3 to 6 in many ways. But we can actually take this all the way up to 64. Would you ever actually do that? Probably not, but just because for the sake of example and because we can, let's go ahead and do it. We're going to have to turn this way down. And you can see that by doing this, what we're really doing is crushing the CPU, right? Bordering on about 60% CPU usage. This is why it's not really practical. And really what we have is like 64 times 3, which is what, like 196 or something along those lines, number of voices. This doesn't sound that exciting though. And that's because we haven't added any of the classic unison spread controls, beginning with pitch. We can actually set the depth, so this would be a whole semitone up. That's going to be way too much. We'll just like bring that down to something like this. And immediately you hear such a huge difference. Let's bring it down even further. So there we have a little bit of a spread happening. Since we have these wavetables, square to saw, we can even randomize that, which is pretty cool. You're hearing a little more girth from those square waves. Doesn't make the biggest difference in the world, but if we were to load up something like, I don't know, just at random here. Here we're starting to hear something a little more interesting. And then pan position, this is the one that's going to get us that really wide sound. Now this gets interesting when we start to add some release, how it's going to cut. So you can hear every time I trigger a new note, what it's really doing is it's cutting off that release tail. So this is almost like a choke group, only without ever actually having to set it up. All right, so that's massive. That's kind of how big of a sound it's possible for you to get in some of those cool randomization controls that you have there on the Unison spread. Moving right along to Serum, we see that here our voicing options and controls feedback. That's over here in the bottom right. We can play, again, chords just from default. No problem. And I think I was covering up the number, but it is corresponding, obviously. We have the ability to go up to 16 by default, but we could obviously adjust that, make that higher or lower. You'll notice that with this instrument, though, when I go and turn on oscillator B, it is actually counting that. And this, and as we go further, the unison number of voices, it's counting that as a second voice. So now when I hit one note, we're counting that as 2. I can detune these a little bit. There you have it. But where this gets really powerful is when we start to multiply the number of voices in each of these oscillators. So we go back to oscillator A, we can take this up to 16. And you see as we do that, the number of available voices is actually adjusting for us automatically. So now when we play a chord, and if we add a little bit longer release, you'll see how that adjusts. But this is a really intelligent instrument, and it kind of knows when you're re-hitting some of the same notes, and it doesn't necessarily take up more voices for that. So very intelligent programming there. And so you can go all the way up to 256. If you bring in oscillator B, you can crank this up to 512. And if you want to go really nuts, you can actually go all the way up to 1024. Will you ever be able to use 1024 simultaneous voices? Probably not, but just for the sake of example, we'll leave it up like that. Obviously, we can go into mono mode, and you'll see then the actual maximum number that we can get is 64 simultaneous voices if we're not playing chords. So pretty cool stuff, right? But this goes even further, especially when we start to come in here and add some kind of like interesting wavetables. I'm just picking some things at complete random here. Let's go to vowel. Bring the level up a little bit. What you're going to see is that when we go to the global page, what we're able to do is we're able to adjust some of these settings. So we can adjust the wavetable position. We can make that random. So if we're just using oscillator A, you can hear that like so, as well as the warp feature, which is corresponding to that knob. We can adjust how these are stacking. Pick something that sounds interesting. Let's go super. And if we want to increase the range, so right now the range when we actually are going and detuning, the max is at 2 semitones. Either way, we could make that more. Really wouldn't make a lot of sense. Really the smart thing to do is to put it like at 1. Let's do some of the same things for oscillator B. You could also adjust the width, so if we wanted the first oscillator to be mono, you can hear that. Doesn't make a lot of sense here. Let's just choose random. So if I go over to my MIDI keyboard and I kind of hit notes all over the place, you're going to hear one really thick and crazy sound. Immediately, if you start playing, 8 notes, you're letting the release come on, and you try to hit 8 totally different notes, then it's getting pushed into overload. So just wanted to show you how far voicing can go and when it really even gets maybe a little bit too far, as is the case probably in this instrument. No reason to actually need to try to use 1024 voices simultaneously. It's not going to make that huge of a difference, but it's great to know that something like that exists. Spire is another one of these modern virtual analog synthesizers that gives you all sorts of voice stacking and Unison Detune options. So we can see here we have a voices count that we can adjust. Let's just go ahead and pump that straight up there to 16. We have different modes here as well, different mono and poly modes. Let's just keep it in the poly mode for now. We can see that for each oscillator, as we go through them, we're going to get different options, or we'll get the same options, and we can adjust what we want to do with our unison, how wide we want to make it, etc. So here with one oscillator, we can go and crank this up to 9 voices, and then start to spread it out. We can head over to oscillator 2, turn that on. Do something like this, go in again, 9 voices, why not? We have these different controls, similar to what we were seeing there on the back page from Serum. Let's use C7, actually. This is kind of cool, isn't it? Wow. Sorry, guys. we could go through all of these oscillators, adjusting the unison mode and all this stuff if you really wanted to push this out to the extreme. So just thought I would go ahead and show you that. Even in an instrument that's supposed to look and feel like a real analog synthesizer, we do have some of these crazy unison modes and voicing modes if we want to get the sound to be super big, super wide. And that's been the trend for a long time, but there is something to be said about sticking with your instruments like Monarch, keeping things, more or less in the ballpark and not potentially crashing your computer for CPU overload. All right, thanks a lot.